Great, thanks Meg. Noswaith dda pawb, braf iawn gweld siwr gymaint o chi efo ni heno. Bydd y cyflwyniad heno yn Saesneg, ond os ydych chi am rhoi cwestiynau i fi yn Cymraeg, mae hwnna'n hollol ffain. Na ateb nhw ar y diwedd. So good evening everyone. Welcome, it's great to see so many of you have joined this evening. As Meg said, there'll be questions at the end. I've just invited any Welsh speakers to also ask questions in Welsh, which might pose a bit of a challenge for Billy, Rob and Meg to facilitate, but yeah, it's absolutely fine. Great, so this evening, I'm going to touch firstly upon myself and what brings me to talk about this subject matter. Then I'm going to move on to talk a bit more broadly about why we should be building with nature in mind, and then talk about an approach and a way of thinking, so nature-friendly thinking more broadly, how we need to do this, as well as think about our buildings. So for those of you kind of completely new to this subject area, that might be interesting for you as well. So then after that, I'm going to focus in on our homes, our gardens, if you're lucky enough to have one, and also ourselves, and why it's important to consider nature with ourselves as well. And then at the end, I'm going to go into a little bit of detail into one area of nature conscious construction. Now, that's quite a big topic area, so you'll have to bear with me on that. I'll only talk about one element, as it could be a whole lecture series in itself. So firstly, to introduce myself. So I'm an architect. I've done my 6 years of full-time training, year and a half of part-time training, and then about 5 years of practice work in varying different roles in between all of that. And those roles varied from being both architectural design, but also sustainability consultant. So I come with a interdisciplinary background, so mixing both the services of how buildings work with also the architectural design. And I suppose that makes me interested also in other areas that architecture joins with and other disciplines, and those kind of areas where things intersect. So within all of that, I've not had time to train as an ecologist, and I would certainly never say that I have the expertise of that ecologists do, but I have been lucky enough to grow up, I suppose, with nature in mind and all around me. So growing up in West Wales, where we have this fantastic kind of diversity of wildlife, but also the mixture of the maritime environment meeting up against a whole range of habitats in Wales, from the mountains down to kind of tidal mudflats. And I've embraced this and explored it both at sea and on land through many of our nature reserves and our the unique islands we have in Wales. So that's a bit about where I come from in terms of the nature element. So architect by training, but environmentalist, and yeah, very enthusiastic and passionate about nature. I also have this feeling of solastalgia. Now, for any of you that don't know the term, it's kind of relatively new and increasing in popularity. And it describes the sense of loss and sadness at the wildlife and that we've lost, and also the damage that's done to our environment. So one example of that for myself is just knowing that when I was a child, there were glowworms in the back garden of my house, and I know that they're not there now. And that's quite upsetting, really, but it's just one tiny drop in an ocean of a much bigger story. And I'm sure many of you here tonight have got very similar stories to that. So if you didn't know the term, that's the term of what you're potentially feeling. So I would, describe myself as a bit of a knowledge grazer, kind of chewing on information as I go by. And I think this quote about trying to learn something about everything, and everything about something really rings true, and especially for architects, where we are generally generalists, but trying to pull in bits of nature thinking into design is certainly something that we advocate at CAT. So moving on then, why build with nature? I'm not going to touch upon too much of this, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, and that might be the reason that's drawn you here tonight. But there is continuing decline in our wildlife, and I've put some fairly depressing figures there from the State of Nature report, both the British one and then the Welsh one, which was published in 2019. But we can also look beyond just the facts and figures, to language, to culture, to stories, art, and archaeology, to kind of point us towards an even greater loss from baselines that are much further in history. So the 1970s data is just when we started taking more data in the UK, but there are other times when there was even more nature, even more wildlife that we've lost to now. So that process of that baseline changing, and there's a term called shifting baseline syndrome, which is worth kind of looking up to see how, if at the moment we have 10 hedgehogs and we get to 20, then yeah, that's great. That's a doubling in the number, but actually we should be having hundreds. So worth looking into that, but it's really important that we acknowledge that when we're looking at wildlife in our urban environments and all the other areas that we might come into contact with it. So every species is essential, and you can think of it as a cog, or Gregor Neve, who's one of the senior consultants at Natural England, who supports us in our teaching at CAT on the architecture course, describes every species as its own handbook or encyclopedia, where if we lose those species through extinction, we kind of lose the opportunity to learn from them, and also learn their relationships to all the other species around them as well. So it's really key that we consider all wildlife all of the time. So the more positive stuff, nature's hugely beneficial to us, to our mental and physical well-being, and there's increasing number of studies pointing to this beneficial nature of nature. So the Environment Agency in England have published this figure of £2.1 billion per annum that could be saved from the NHS budget by simply giving more access to green space to people. That's a pretty remarkable figure. But also then it provides a huge amount of services to us. So these are termed ecosystem services by the kind of ecologists and specialists, and also people that want to kind of quantify what nature gives to us. So that can mean that a tree might give us timber, or it might mean that plant species absorb pollution, and that's all providing a service to us, of which the value of that is, just huge. And then also finally, designing in spaces for nature can alleviate inequality. So at the moment, there is an inherent inequality in terms of how people can access nature, and we need to constantly address that. And by thinking of building it into our designs and into our infrastructure, we can alleviate some of that inequality of access to green spaces. So what are the impacts of our urban environment on the natural environment. And why should we build with nature in mind? Well, urban areas and built up areas can have direct impacts and they can have indirect impacts. So directly, they can reduce habitat, they can degrade habitats, and they can also fragment habitats, just as this road is showing, splitting that habitat in two with no access across for any kind of ground-based at least. But there's also indirect ecological impacts. So through consuming energy, our buildings contribute to climate breakdown. And that climate breakdown is a huge stress and also a detrimental factor for species. But also what we consume within buildings. So their materials, the energy that's consumed, the water that they consume, and the waste that they produce, all of these create indirect ecological impacts. So we need to understand them a little bit more, or much more, really. And why should we do it? Well, because it also enhances well-being, as I've set out, and has the opportunity to reduce inequality. So I've done a fairly crude what's regulated, what's not on this, with a little traffic light system. So there's two ways in the UK generally that you can regulate in the building industry. So that's through the planning framework, and what can get planning permission and what can't, and then through building control, so building regulations. So lots of habitat is, I would say, fairly well regulated. There's obviously circumstances where it still needs to be better, but there's a lot of good work and interesting work being done by the environmental organisations, Environment Agency, Natural England and NRW. But the other elements, so habitat degradation, habitat fragmentation, there's still certainly areas that are just not regulated. So that's why they've got an amber. And then the indirect ecological impacts, especially of building and the built environment, are really poorly regulated within those places. So there's big governmental targets, but when they filter down, they're actually heavily diluted. So in terms of the materials that we use, there's very little that regulates what materials we can and can't use. In terms of energy, yes, there are energy standards, but they need to go much further. And we're also not seeing any regulation to provide beneficial elements. So where nature can be regulated to be brought in so that it enhances well-being. All of those schemes that we did have, such as Code for Sustainable Homes, I mean, that's long gone now. For the last 9 years, we've not had that, but that did start to address some of this. So those are elements that really need to have much more regulation around them. So thinking nature friendly, it's really important that we think beyond just our built environment and actually understand the context of what it is, of the kind of wider setting. So in the UK, our urban areas take up approximately about 6% of the UK landmass. Now, when we look globally, that's even less, and those figures are for landmass, not Earth's surface area, so not counting all the water. So we have to acknowledge that actually we need to make a positive impact beyond our urban environments before we look to our urban environments and our homes. So this graphic down on the bottom left shows, which is taken from CAT's Zero Carbon Britain research, which you can find out a lot more about online, shows that we've got roughly in the UK, showing all of the landmass of the UK in little 1 megahectare squares. So there's roughly 24 megahectares in the UK. So we've got about 1.5 megahectares of urban space. And then all of the rest is then land that is either for us and sustains us, or doesn't and provides other services, or is just unmanaged. So we need to look at how we manage that so that it's much more nature friendly. And Zero Carbon Britain looks at that for carbon, but within that, you'll see that there's also much more unmanaged, conserved spaces, and then the increase of all this, or the kind of reshaping of the other areas would be beneficial for nature and wildlife as well. So one place that you can start to kind of look at this and start to understand the picture more broadly is Kate Raworth's Donut Economics, and I'd really encourage you, if you haven't looked into this before, to take some time to go and have a look at it. It's a fantastic piece of work, and I often reference it with my students as well at CAT. So this is saying essentially we want to be in that nice green donut space so that we're keeping within our ecological ceiling and we're not pushing out into these boundaries. And we're also bringing we've got a good social foundation and when we don't have any shortfall. But for nature friendly, I've developed a zoned approach, zones of influence, which is broadly inspired by the permaculture approach to zoning and areas that you regularly engage with in terms of harvesting food for yourself and services to maintain you. And I'm going to touch upon this now over the next short while as an approach to how we need to think more nature friendly in our zones that we can influence. So the first zone is the wilderness spaces, the unmanaged spaces. So it's really, these are few and far between globally now, and in the UK there's potentially even less, arguably none left truly. But these places have been inhabited by people, by humans, and that have lived in harmony in those spaces. And those people have also been consistently persecuted and continue to be. So we've got to be really careful that we don't just say wilderness space has to be no people space, because those places can be lived in harmony with the natural environment. And there's a risk as well of us saying of other places around the world that they should protect something in a certain way when we live another way. So we have to be careful of a kind of colonial type protectionism as well. But we can still have influence on these spaces. And that, if we really want to, we should focus that on prioritizing support for grassroots organizations in those areas. And that will then obviously benefit the nature and the wildlife within those zones. We can also be conscious consumers, making sure that what we buy doesn't nibble away at the edges and slowly degrade these wilderness spaces around the world. And I'm going to touch on this a little bit later and how buildings and construction impact these areas. So moving then down the zones, I've put zones 4 and 3 together, so semi-managed and then more managed landscapes. So this makes up the vast majority of the world now, and our land mass. And they're the zones that sustain us, so they're very important to us. And we can also heavily influence these zones by what we choose to buy. So thinking around our food and everything that we consume, our clothing, all of that stuff, it's really important that we think day to day about what it is we're buying and that it is as nature friendly as it can be. I'm not going to touch too much into the detail of that, but simply put, if you've got the resource available to you to be able to impact daily, then you should try to do that. You should try to buy ethically and environmentally conscious foodstuffs, clothing, all of that sort of thing. Obviously, at the moment, we're in a situation where that's not viable for everyone. So we have to work to address that so that those areas of land are managed both for us and for wildlife. So there's a photograph of lapwing there as a really identifiable species in the UK, where we need to change our land practices so that we can support our species. Lapwing, also curlew, as well, are another really key species that we need to be supporting, with the balance of acknowledging that we also need food from our land as well. So CAT has a whole webinar series that looks much more landscape scale, and those are all available through our website. So I'd encourage you to kind of dive into those, that content, to find out more. So then down to our local area, local environment. So this is a really important area to think about, and I'd encourage you all to engage as much as possible. And if you're already engaging, then try to bring more people in to this area. And the way that I define this area, which is kind of an area that is known well to you. So it could be a naturally known area. So through its, watershed and watercourse, or somewhere where you just walk regularly, all that sort of thing. In Welsh, we actually have our own term that describes it, and our sense of relationship and belonging to that space. So we can make a huge amount of difference to this area through community initiatives. And that can also be in our urban environment, so in towns and cities, through initiatives like community supported agriculture, community gardens, Be Friendly status, advocating for that, campaigning to your local authority because every local authority will have an estates department, or a department that goes out and cuts all the grass and trims the hedges and that sort of thing. So you can campaign and advocate for more nature-friendly practices in those areas. And that will make where we live more nature-friendly, because this will be all around us. So think carefully about your region, but more importantly, just get involved. And actually, there's a dual benefit there, that it will also bring us closer together within our communities. Now, this is all obviously caveated in the sense of when we're able to get back outside, and in each other's company. So moving on, where we can impact right now, today, our homes, this is obviously where we live, and we can share this area with a remarkable amount of wildlife. Even in an urban environment, it can be quite amazing how much wildlife there is, and also interesting how wildlife changes its behavior to appropriate our urban areas, because there's more opportunity there. So I'm going to set out later on the kind of opportunities within your own homes and gardens, and also potential pitfalls to look out for. So then, in this kind of zoned approach of where we should influence and how we should try and think nature friendly, we've got ourselves. So this is what we know, what we sense, what we feel, all of those things. So I've set out before how important nature is for our well-being and can really benefit us. But we really need to combat a loss of nature literacy through our education system and through just general awareness, as we kind of develop increasingly through technology. Looking outside and looking at the world around us is really important. And this is really completely interlinked with culture and language, as I said before. So we can do this actively. We can go out and practice Shinri Yoku, the act of forest bathing, the traditional Japanese act of forest bathing, or we can do it passively by choosing to jump on the bike instead of go in the car, or walk through the park instead of get on the tube. All those sorts of things are ways that we can just engage ourselves more with nature, but also improve our knowledge. So find out more, go to wetland open days or reserve open days or whatever they might be, and improve your knowledge. And there's other, as I said before, there's more webinars specifically on nature as well, both by CAT and then other organisations as well. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to our homes and our gardens, and focus a bit more on those last two zones that I set out in those slides, but what we can influence, yeah, much more close to home. So first of all, we need to understand the impacts of our homes and our urban environments on nature. So I set out before that there's loss of habitat, habitat degradation, habitat fragmentation, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail of what those are now. So loss of habitat. Obviously, there's an inherent loss of habitat from the building's footprint. It is no longer a natural piece of land, but it's not very helpful to think about that because we need our space, and we can, there's quite a debate there as to how much space we need and so on, but ultimately we need some space to live comfortably. But what is worse is how we might lose habitat around our homes. So approaching our gardens in certain ways, covering up for the reasons of maintenance or whatever it may be, with plastic grass or patios or all those sorts of things, remove habitat which could be beneficial and could be an opportunity for nature. So the first thing to think about is, are there any places where I can undo that potential previous loss of habitat? Now, you don't have to go and dig anything up. Just putting pots and planters on top of those surfaces is a start. So then on to habitat degradation. This is a really kind of big area and a really tricky one to counteract. So firstly, we've got disturbance. Now, just our presence to wildlife is a disturbance, unless they're in a space where they're very familiar. So the urban environments, as I was saying. So there's limited that we can do there, but you can think creatively around ways that you might be able to reduce that. But predation is one where another difficult area. So our pets, for instance, our cats and even our dogs sometimes that we have can predate on wildlife right outside our windows. And that's a really challenging area to discuss because they come and sit on our lap and they're our best friend, but then they also do have a huge impact when you look nationally at wildlife. So that's another issue with our homes. Then we've got pollutants that come from our homes. So this might be particulate pollution and carbon pollution from the way that we choose to heat our homes, or it could be liquid pollution from what comes out of our drains and the chemicals we use within our homes, or it could be treatments and things that we put on the surfaces. So being really careful about some of those things and trying to think about those elements and what making the most nature-friendly conscious decision in those areas. And this equally applies to how you manage a garden as well. So lighting then is another really big issue. And there's great initiatives like and a lot of work being done to try and preserve dark skies and acknowledging the significance of them. So for a developing problem at the moment is that we're designing more buildings on coastlines with big windows, and so those big windows at night make a much brighter appearance on our coastlines. So, and coastlines are generally, and out to sea, are places where migrating wildlife chooses to move, so migrating birds, but also insects. So that added light can cause disruption to those migrations and play havoc with them. I mean, just as much as a cruise ship out at sea will do the same. There's essentially big floating light emitters overnight, if you've ever seen them. Then there's also noise, so this comes into the kind of disturbance as well aspect of habitat degradation. So then fragmentation as well. Our homes and our gardens do this as well. We like to identify exactly where our land is by putting in boundaries, walls, fences, and that can stop the natural roaming path of wildlife and the need for wildlife to get from A to B. So those are the kind of those key environmental issues or impacts of buildings. But we've also got the physical impacts, which aren't necessarily linked to any of these. So some of our physical elements of our buildings cause difficulties for wildlife. So our windows can become mirrors, which might make a bird think that it's trying to ward off someone else from being on its patch, for instance. You may have seen that yourselves, but more dangerously, windows, if they are reflecting green space, birds think that green space is beyond, so they can fly straight into them and cause bird strike. A really simple way to stop that happening is either through putting manifestations, so kind of stickers of patterns on your windows, or through actually bringing bird feeders closer to your window. That will reduce the flight time from the bird feeder to the window, so it won't be a fatal impact. They will also be more aware, and you get the benefit of seeing the birds closer. Then also our drains around our houses to get rid of all that water that falls down in the UK is a real big problem for amphibians who trotting along will just fall down, and we lose a huge amount of our newts and frogs to our drainage system, and they can't survive once they are in that system and through to a waste treatment plant where they're kind of going to be churned around. So it's not great, and there are ways that we can look at that, and there are some really good infrastructure scale initiatives that can kind of just guide amphibians around the kind of drainage spots, which is good to see. And then there's also things that we put in place to protect our buildings. So nets, you'll quite often see them in towns and cities around historic buildings where we haven't maintained the masonry enough. So they're put in place to stop bits of the building falling on us, which is, an important task, but they're a real danger to birds for getting tangled in them. So I've put just 3 there, but there will be other elements that we kind of need to kind of consider and be aware of. So now I'm going to talk for the next 2 slides about our opportunities that we have around our houses. And the first, before we look at our buildings and our houses, is the garden. And if you've got a garden, then that's absolutely the best place to improve for biodiversity and wildlife. So we've actually already got a webinar on how to be a climate change savvy gardener, which talks about both being, climate resilient, but also nature friendly. So I'd encourage you to look at that if you want to find more for your gardens. But my top tips are summarized as thinking like the wildlife that you want to see. So that's really thinking about how's the wildlife going to get in, where's it going to take shelter, and what food is there for it. So if you think about those things, then and you set those up, you might start to see more coming in. Look at the edges and the boundaries. So I said this before, so to reduce that fragmentation. Celebrate diversity. So just diversity of planting and also scale, all those sorts of things can provide different areas, different food sources, different flowering times for our insects. So celebrate those species in your garden and try and maximize them. Expand the edge. So this is a classic permaculture trick where you, by expanding the edge space, and that's the edge between different habitats or different types of spaces, you get benefits within that, or you get real interesting mixes within that edge space. So by expanding it with curves, you can actually improve biodiversity and the diversity of species. Introducing water, ponds are another fantastic way to get a kind of completely different range of species than you might already have or be used to in your gardens. And then embrace the messy. So untidiness is actually fantastic for wildlife. Much better than a kind of very tidy, very neat lawn is a unmown lawn. So sign up to No Mow May, or leave a patch of your lawn that you choose not to mow for the whole year, and know that that will actually then be a breeding ground for insects, which will then form food for your bird species, and you might have predator birds, or all sorts might start to come in just because of that decision not to mow a certain area. So then on to our actual homes. So this is there are opportunities in and on our homes for wildlife. And for those of you that might already have wildlife in your homes, what I'd encourage you to do is just to sit back, to enjoy watching them of an evening. You might want to watch the bats coming out of your roof if they're already in there, or the return of the swallows and the house martins, whatever it may be, but really crucially, leave it be. Quite a number of species are protected, so it might well be illegal for you to disturb or remove them. And if you are likely to need to disturb them or do anything, then you need to seek professional advice. So that's where you go straight to an ecologist, not an architect, although an architect might help you with the designs of whatever it is you want to do. Get creative if they are a nuisance. So if you've got some house martins above your door and they keep pooing, then put in a guano shelf that might catch them, or just think of yourself as lucky if you do get pooed on, because it's good luck for however many years, isn't it? So then on to the habitat that we can bring in. Now, I'm not going to say you should put this bat box there and this bird box there, mainly for the reason that wildlife is incredibly picky, and every species has its own likes. And might like the south side, or might not like the south side, or might like that side because it looks at certain trees. But what I would say is there's actually nothing wrong with providing habitat. So you can just do it, but just know that the wildlife might not want to come. But actually, even if you do provide it, it's a great educational opportunity. So this example by Sarah Wigglesworth Architects is just a really great example of a process of engagement with school kids. This is a forest school extension where they got to design their habitat wall, and then the actual implementation of it. And even if no birds or bats actually go into those boxes, it's still a great educational tool. So yeah, take that as your kind of main drive, is that there's nothing necessarily wrong with providing habitat, but wildlife can be quite picky sometimes, and however much effort you might put in one place, it might still choose not to go there. So then building new. If you are looking to build new buildings, then think about integrated ecological details. So things like green roofs, things like providing eaves overhangs. So if a house martin does turn up, or it can choose to go up in the eaves and roost there. Think about creepers and planting creepers around the house, amongst other things, but also be wary of the kind of green gimmicks as well. So green walls, I would say, are a bit of a no-no because of the amount of infrastructure they take. They take a lot of watering, and they also take a lot of, essentially hanging pots on the wall that require a lot of maintenance, when actually you're better off putting that, what you would put in the green wall, on the ground in your garden. So you can talk to designers and talk to ecologists, wildlife enthusiasts about what species you might want to include the provision for in those details. So this is just a final kind of note of caution on zones one, looking at our homes, in that we need to be careful. And it's really nice to think that we should just open up our homes to wildlife and let them in all the time. But our homes can also be quite dangerous for wildlife. So they can trap by allowing wildlife in and then it not finding a way out. Certain materials like roofing membranes, modern roofing membranes, are known to entangle bats from their very fine claws, and that can, as a minimum, cause stress and at worst cause fatalities, which, when we really need to protect those species, is really important that we don't inadvertently cause those fatalities. Also, wildlife can become a pest. Now, I'm sure many of you here tonight, or the people that are on this call, will not necessarily see wildlife in that view, in that way. But if it is deemed to be a pest, it can unnecessarily increase negative sentiment, and we don't want that. So if you don't put an insect mesh around your cladding, you may well get wasps. And that may well then lead to a lot more negative sentiment about wasps, when actually wasps are a fantastic pollinator species. As well as having a fairly harmful sting, they actually do a great amount for us as well. So if we can try and keep them away, then it's a good thing to do so. And with that, wildlife can also damage our buildings. And as we aim for more efficiency in our buildings, so that they are better in terms of their carbon and overall environmental impact, we don't want them to become damaged by wildlife, so they reduce their performance, so they're actually worse for the environment after that. But the main thing to do in being careful is not to worry about it. And when you're looking at maintenance of your own homes, just to think carefully around that as well, because clearing off all of the ivy around the wall might feel like a good idea, but it equally is a great habitat. So if you have an old building or you live in an old home, then just acknowledging that there may well be wildlife that lives within it, and so careful maintenance is key for that. Great. So finally, in the presentation, I'm going to touch upon nature conscious construction. So this is a big, very big, large topic area that we could, as I said before, could spend a whole series looking at, because of the wide range of impacts and opportunities that we have in construction. So when I talk about construction, I'm talking about building new and then large scale building new as well. So building new estates and large new buildings in cities and that sort of thing. And this process of construction affects all zones that I talked about before. And we have to definitely try and avoid it impacting the zone 5, the wilderness, and mitigate any impact on the other zones as well. And it can do that. It can impact on those zones through the energy that it uses in the building, the materials that it uses, the waste from a building, water runoff, pollutants. I've kind of set some of these out before. So ultimately, we should take a fabric first approach to what we build, especially in the UK and in our climate, and also in other kind of colder climates, taking a fabric first approach. So that's what I mean by that, is that we look at making the building as efficient as we can first, before we look at any technologies or anything like that. So low and zero carbon approach is really key. And that is inherently wildlife and nature friendly, because that is the best way that we can reduce the lifetime energy of the building. And that lifetime energy, if it's really high, will have a higher impact on climate breakdown, which will have a higher knock-on impact on nature and wildlife. So fabric first is key. Circular building then is another way that we can think more broadly nature friendly. So thinking about the end of life and making sure that our buildings are able to be repaired or disassembled, or could even compost if we're using natural materials, or if we have to, we recycle, so that things aren't going to landfill, which obviously has a environmental impact. Then there's kind of the site scale measures, which I'm not touching upon, which are kind of shown in that image, where you have, which are more related to the kind of water runoff, and making sure that you're providing habitat, but also not allowing all the water that runs off your site to go straight into watercourses and cause flooding. And then an area that I am going to touch on to finish is a materials that we use in our buildings. So, and an approach to that. So increasingly in architecture circles, at least, the conversation about low embodied carbon materials is kind of progressing now. It's yet to be regulated, but there's increasingly more tools out there and resource. But low carbon doesn't necessarily mean wildlife friendly. It certainly helps, but there's certain areas where it may not be. So what do I mean by kind of low carbon and the approach at CAT? So traditionally, if we look at pre-industrial buildings, we made them out of traditional low tech, low energy, low carbon materials, because that was what was available. It's all we could do. Then early industrial, we started to develop high performance materials because they gave us lots of light through windows. Glass is very high embodied carbon, and certain other materials. And now mature industrial. So this is what I would still say most of the construction industry is doing. It's where we use high performance, high impact materials to build 90% of our buildings. And then we use the last 10% to decorate our buildings with natural things, low embodied carbon materials. So this image at the top, if any of you Cardiff, anyone's from Cardiff, you might recognise it as the Wales Millennium Centre, where the architect decided to use slate as a finish. Now you can build walls, you can build roofs with slate, but they've attached it back to a steel structure. So you've got the high performance steel, high impact, and then the low impact slate as a finish, which is just really bizarre. And what we advocate at CAT is that we flip that and we actually try and build 80% of our buildings, most of our buildings, out of low carbon materials. And then the 20% at the end is needed to make our buildings work and be efficient. And we call those industrial vitamins. So those supplements that just finish off the building where they're absolutely needed. So as I said, though, low carbon doesn't mean wildlife friendly, or doesn't always mean. It goes a long way. So looking at a kind of local natural hierarchy, we can, and the low carbon materials, we're looking at crops, timber, and then composites of these kind of timber and crops, binding them together to make different building products. Now, as I said before, In zones 3 and 4, the semi-managed and regularly managed spaces is where this stuff comes from. And that area can be managed in an un-wildlife friendly way. So there's real issues with large monoculture crops or supplements that we give to these crops, or pesticides that we put on them to reduce the number of pests so that we have a higher yield or whatever it is. So we have to look to how we can get those crops more efficiently for nature and for ourselves. Now, one of the real things that everyone's talking about at the moment is planting trees. And that's a great thing. We should plant more trees, but equally, we can't just always plant broadleaf trees. We need to plant trees to build with, because we don't want to end up in 40 years where we don't have any trees that are, or timber that is good for building. And we've got to also do that in an environmentally considerate way. So I'm certainly an advocate for more trees, but I'm an advocate for the right trees in the right place. And also the same with crops. So the right crops in the right place. And straw bale being an interesting one. So most of our straw crop comes from the east coast of the UK, and most of our straw bale building happens in the west and southwest, which doesn't make a huge amount of sense. So you need to be careful around where those come from. And then also, when they do get to the building, we have to think about the finishes and how we detail it so we can mitigate finishes. So materials these days, because they're off the shelf, roofing products come pre-applied fungicides on them, just so that you don't get the growth of anything on them, to avoid any maintenance. Our glues, our paints can all be damaging for the environment. So we have to be really careful about how we detail with natural materials so that they are still nature friendly. So just to summarize then, on everything that I've kind of talked about, I'd encourage you all to be grazers of information and just absorb the little tidbits of wildlife knowledge as you go through your kind of life and how that might intermix with your career as well and work. Bask in the greatness of nature, be it in your own home or when we can get back out into our more wild spaces around us. Feel empowered and driven to help nature, both from a place of grief at its loss, but also an acknowledgement of its huge value to us and the planet. Think nature friendly on those different zones. So think about your daily impact from wilderness through those semi and regularly managed spaces through to our homes and ourselves as well. Engage with or start local wildlife initiative and groups, get together with your local community. Start to plan now before you're able to get together through these types of means. And then look at your own garden and house and take a kind of walk around and think, what are the risks to wildlife and what are the opportunities and what can I do? And also go out and ask wildlife enthusiasts. There's a few people starting to set up kind of consultancies for your own homes, but it's certainly an area where there's not a lot of people doing that. But so find people that are really enthusiastic. And think nature-friendly construction if you're in that industry, and think beyond just embodied carbon as well. So thank you very much, diolch yn fawr. And I think Meg will be coming back, hopefully, to facilitate some questions.
Hello, yes, thanks, Gwyn. That was absolutely brilliant. So many great bits of advice, and I think a really useful way of framing it in terms of the zones. So yeah, thank you. We'll move straight into some questions if that's all right, because we've got quite a few coming in. So I will, if anyone does need to go at past, then thank you for joining, but hopefully you can all stay for a few questions. So we'll start with Philip on Facebook, who's asked, with housing in urban areas, is it better to retrofit housing stock or demolish and build new passive housing, probably with less garden and more shared outdoor space?
That's a very good question. And in terms of the embodied carbon, it's probably better to retrofit than to demolish. Now, sometimes, depending on the state of the housing and whatever it may be, it might be that you have to demolish, but you should always take a retrofit first approach, because that will reduce your embodied carbon, which if you can reduce the amount of materials that you need, you're also going to reduce the impact that that's going to have more broadly beyond just the building. But if you do have to demolish, then I would say look to see what materials you can reuse from that building. We don't do enough material reuse at all. Sophie Pelsmaker, who's a researcher in Finland, is doing lots of good research in this area, actually, in terms of kind of cutting out whole bits of brick wall and seeing how that can be reused. So yeah, retrofit first, and then if you can't, aim to reuse as much as possible so that you're not needing to impact wider spaces.
Great, thank you. And then the next question from George. So I know you said about green walls being a bit of a nightmare, but George asks, is there any scope for retrofitting normal roofs with green roofs, or is this an architectural nightmare?
I'm probably going to give an architect's response to that, in that it really depends on the situation, which is a kind of, every project is different. There's a green roof is usually heavier, which is probably the main issue you're going to come up against. And also a green roof has generally a maximum pitch. So if you're working with a pitched roof, it's going to be quite challenging to be able to get a green roof. But if you already have flat roofs or shallow roofs, then there may well be ways of doing it. It would be quite invasive on your, you would need to completely redecorate that space, and the whole roof structure would come off, and you'd need to seek structural advice as well. Are the foundations good enough? Are the walls good enough? That would be the kind of main area of issue, probably, is the structural integrity. You can get shallower green roofs though, and I didn't touch too much on green roofs, but so brown roofs and things like that, so which would still need the structural design. I'm not saying they wouldn't, but might provide another way around it. If you wanted a deep green roof, so an intensive, I think there's intensive and extensive, I never get them the right way around, then it's more than likely almost impossible. Big enough to put plants and shrubs, you're probably not going to get through.
Thank you. It is past now. I don't know if you're happy to do a couple more questions.
More than happy. Yeah, sorry, I probably ran on a bit.
No, that's fine. Lots of advice to give. Okay, great. So the next question from Mike is, there is potentially conflict between retrofit for energy efficiency and protection of urban wildlife, bats, nesting birds, etc. Bats and birds roost and nest outside the thermal envelopes who do not affect energy efficiency but can lose their nest sites during this work. Is there any advice available on this from CAT or elsewhere?
I trailed off on the end there. You might have to say it again, but essentially, is there any advice for mitigating that loss of habitat or roosting space or maternity roost space for bats? Yeah, so I mean, it's certainly a challenging one to do, because usually, I mean, if they're significant bat species, you're going to be looking at whole new spaces for them, or giving over roof space for them to access. It's not impossible to still design them in, but you would need the kind of combination of an ecologist and an architect probably to be able to work out the detail. And again, it depends on the context of where you're going to do it. I wouldn't say that there's a blanket issue though, because most of our housing stock, I don't want to be too general and say that it would be fine, but a lot of our housing stock wouldn't necessarily have that impact. And if you're doing large scale retrofit, which is what we need to do, then you can pool mitigation measures together. And I know that sounds a little bit odd, but I know that Natural England are doing a huge amount of work in that area, in terms of kind of district thinking and thinking wider scale. So you're not just looking at exactly one house at a time. Yeah, so it's a challenging one, certainly. And I've probably only done half of an answer for it, sorry.
Thank you. Okay, the next couple of questions on kind of the less friendly wildlife that you're talking about. So Ellen asks, do we count fly spray, rat poison, traps, etc. as predation? And then linking to that, Ellie is asking, what recommendations do you have for urban spaces where there are certain disease-carrying critters such as rats, and they would worry about city rats taking over spaces?
Sure. Okay. It's, yeah, I mean, it certainly is an issue. I don't necessarily know enough about it, about rats necessarily, but I suppose what you can do is rats will generally take the opportunity to come if there's food available. So making sure that, you know, if you've got compost heaps in your garden, that there's no access to them for that. Or yeah, those sorts of measures I would say are key. And I wouldn't necessarily say that, you know, having a messy garden means that there's more rats. Messiness can mean just that there's twigs lying on the floor, and that's not necessarily more inviting for a rat than anything else. Flies and other things, I'm not a specialist, but, you know, I used to not be so happy about wasps, but have certainly changed my mind. You know, flies, horse flies, it's still going to take more encouragement from people that really are into their insects to make me think that horse flies are great. So I'm sorry, but I don't have the expertise on that to kind of necessarily know in every case. Yeah.
Thank you. So we'll just have a couple more questions, I think. Steve says, is there much that can be done in a small city garden?
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge amount. In terms of the, and I'd point you towards the Climate Change Savvy Gardener webinar as well for that, which is kind of looking at the whole range of spaces. But that approach of thinking about diversity of species. So even if, you know, you've got complete boundaries that you can't alter, you can still provide a little mini haven for flying wildlife to come in, so insects, and that will bring the birds as well. So I would absolutely still encourage you to kind of explore what you can do. You know, Gardener's World often has features on kind of the more wildlife, orientated gardens, as well as the kind of horticulture side. And there's, you know, even on a canal boat or wherever it may be, there's always opportunity. Even, you know, a window box, although you have to be careful with window boxes in high buildings.
Brilliant, thank you. And then just the last question from Filippo then, which I think, yeah, sums up the whole webinar quite nicely, is how much potential does architecture have in supporting wildlife? How closely can humans and wildlife be in terms of coexisting harmoniously without impacting and disturbing them?
It's an interesting one. A large amount of it depends on what we want to live with and what balance we want. So there's absolutely ways that we can live more harmoniously, but I would say potentially not in the UK climate if you also want your house to be warm, your house to be draft free. Whereas if you're living in a climate where you can be much more open, then arguably you could open it up to much more wildlife in certain areas, and perhaps for certain species, it's still going to be challenging. But there's always going to be a difference there, and there probably always has been. And there's, you could look to all the historic examples of where we chose to give ourselves elevated platforms, potentially to get up off the ground, to get away from the critters and all of that. So there's always an element of, we don't necessarily want them that close, but we absolutely can live more harmoniously and have our space and allow them to have their space. And that's probably what I would advocate, and do our best to not cause pests to also take over as well, as I can see there's a bit of chat in the chat going on about that. So
brilliant, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Gwyn. I think we will round it up there, but thanks very much for answering all those questions, and thanks everyone for getting involved with the Q&A as well. So yeah, thanks everyone for joining, and once we close the webinar, we'll ask you for a bit of feedback on a feedback form on our website, and it also includes some session reflection questions. So that's just kind of for you to reflect on tonight's webinar and take the learning forward. So feel free to use the boxes there, or just do it in your own time. And yeah, as Gwyn's mentioned, the past webinars that we have recordings of, do check them out on the website, and there's also lots of information there about our postgraduate and short courses, and lots of green building related ones, including the Masters of Sustainable Architecture that Gwyn is a lecturer on. And we've also got information on upcoming Zero Carbon Britain courses there as well. So the next one is on the 29th, 30th of April online, and we're offering some free places for those who could otherwise unable to attend. So do check those out and share it around your networks if you can. And then, yeah, this is the last in our winter series of webinars. So thank you everyone for joining, and we're currently planning for the spring webinar series. So do keep an eye on the website and in our e-news for details of those. But otherwise, yeah, just to say thank you everyone for joining. And Gwyn, I don't know if you've got any final words. Thank you very much for speaking tonight.
Thank you very much, everyone. Diolch yn fawr.
Diolch yn fawr.